Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Dr. Kermit Jones, MDJD. We just did a little live Instagram chat, and here we are. We're going to continue the conversation. I'm just going to jump right at it. This is the number one question I'm getting for you. We asked it on Instagram, but I want to repeat it here. MDJD. What's that about? Why did you do that?
Yeah, I think the best way for me to explain it is I knew I wanted to be a doctor since I was 8 years old. And what I had learned shadowing a doctor that was retiring when I was in high school was that medicine was changing. There were a lot of people that were trying to get into it, not just, I think, for the motivation of taking care of patients, but because they saw a lot of money in the industry and they were trying to figure out, how to move the industry in their direction. So the advice I got was if I wanted to be someone who not only took care of patients and advocated for them, but was also able to translate that advocacy and interest into what policymakers needed in order for us to get the right policies for healthcare, I had to understand both sides of the table. So I had to understand the medical aspect, which we do every single day. And then I had to understand how policymakers and lawyers make their decisions and the legal frameworks that they use to make decisions. And so that's why I decided to do both programs.
So you, at an early age, were interested in not just being a doctor, but then also in policy stuff. Where did that come from? It sounds like that was the end in mind that made sense to you to do a dual MDJD program.
Yeah, I think it was probably just my desire to argue that just came from being a kid, and I just couldn't help myself.
We should find something to argue about, although I would be careful because a lot of my lawyer friends I've found are much better professional arguers than I think I was as a kid. I thought I was a great arguer. I did debate in high school, but then I became a doctor and I didn't continue with my arguing development.
Yeah, well, don't argue with someone who gets paid to argue for a living, right? I mean, unless you probably want to lose or they're just not getting paid a lot of money to do it. I feel like I knew I wanted to do it, and I was trying to decide between medicine and law, but it really was a lot of these discussions that you would see in the 80s and 90s about, okay, someone has a particular illness. And in the 80s, the big issue was AIDS and HIV, right?
Yeah.
And so people were trying to figure out, I think it was Ryan White or something, should the kid be able to go to school? Shouldn't he be able to go to school? Or,
right.
Why were there so many issues with, the number of people that were HIV positive being so much higher in communities of color and minority communities? And so these are discussions that I think, we can inform the discussion as doctors and as scientists. But when you take that data and you translate it, you really need people that understand policy to say, no, there are some legal rights, constitutional rights that this kid had, in order to be able to access the resources that the state provided. And when you balance that against the risk, it is the right and moral decision for this person to be able to go to school. And so you can kind of do that with so many other situations. And unless you really understand, I think, the way that arguments are made, the way that evidence is looked at, whether it's in legislation or in the courts, then it's going to be harder to make that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm 42, and I'm like, wow, this guy at age 8, he was thinking ahead. Like, do what you wanted to do. You got a great education, and here you are poised to make a big difference. Let's jump into, this is the COVID pandemic year. I bet you have a thought or two on things as both a doctor and someone interested in politics. I'm gonna shoot you the open-ended question of, let's play Monday morning quarterback. How did we do in 2020 with COVID? What would you have done differently? What would you do going from here on out? You could take that wherever you want.
Yeah, I think, there's so many different ways that you can hit COVID that would never, I think, reflect all of the sadness and loss and lost opportunities that has come out of this pandemic. And you're right. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking, but I would say it unfortunately was the perfect storm of seeing what happens when politics gets in the way of public policy, gets in the way of public health, and then the interests of a few are put before the health of the many. So, I mean, I think that's honestly the biggest thing I can say about it. Now, in terms of what we do differently moving forward, it starts with. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so to spell that out a little bit more, the interests of the few. You mean businesses keeping things open? What, as opposed to, and then all of the people, especially minorities, who suffered and died of COVID, and then the whole behavior aspect. Like, I'm wondering where did we go the most wrong or veer off course? How could we have done it differently? Part of the challenge when I'm looking at it in social media is there's just so much nonsense out there, and propaganda and conspiracy theories, and it's a huge battle to hold it all together and fight this disease,
Oh, it totally is. Yeah, and I'll say, just to kind of, make sure I rephrase what, may have been miscommunicated earlier. Yeah, no, there have been tons of people that have died of this. Definitely not just, minorities. I mean, like the number of people over 80 that have died of this, or the 40% of people that have died being in nursing homes, or, being over 75 to 80 years old, cuts across ethnicities and genders and everything else. But when I mean the interests of the few,
yeah,
I mean the political power interest. I'm not talking about things like small businesses. I mean, these are people that in many instances put their life savings and hard work into a business. And, if we tell them, hey, you have to shut down, if the government says that, the government has to give them the resources to stay open too, because that's part of the lifeblood. Those are the people that employ people. And that's part of who we tax in order to have the benefits that we have. But when I mean the interests of the few, I mean, it's a crisis of leadership, meaning that there was a statistic I saw a while back that said, like, every year or two, there's more data produced in the world than there was in every other year combined before that. And it just keeps happening.
Oh my God.
It's ridiculous. I mean,
Feels about right.
I mean, seriously, you think about social media, you think about all the different outlets. So people are craving not just information, Larry, they're craving leadership. And so I think the biggest casualty of COVID and this year was a crisis of leadership. We had a situation where people were looking to the people that were in control and saying, what do we do? And there were so many conflicting messages and so many, honestly, self-interested messages that the things that shouldn't have been political, like wearing masks, became political. Things like trying to figure out how we balance keeping the economy open versus keeping people safe became political. So that's what I mean, the interests of the few over the health of the many.
Yeah, good. I'm just like listening to you talk, and I imagine some folks watching may not have your insight to be able to kind of see through a lot of the stuff, to see the politics that are really going on in front of them.
Yeah. I mean, politics is about staying on message, right? I mean, this is taught to politicians from like Politics 101. And in many instances, it's really hard, and it's actually considered political suicide to move away from message. You have to, the only reason you move away from message from a political calculation standpoint is if you realize that the message you have is so bad that it's not working. And I'll just give you a good case example. Not to pick on President Trump, but, you may remember that around the first couple of weeks of March, he gave a talk or some type of press conference in which he basically was saying everything's fine, there's nothing to worry about, and the markets tanked. No one had any type of support or belief in what he was saying. And then the very next day, he came out and had all of these CEOs and business leaders kind of, lined up in front of the podium to talk. And then the market started to settle a little bit, right? And so in those instances, I think
I remember he lined up like Walgreens or all these. And I remember that.
S&P 500 companies. And sadly, I think that was done because he realized that message was not working. It wasn't done because, I think he felt necessarily, hey, maybe I'm actually wrong. in my calculation, because this is the guy that people, listen to, maybe not listen to, but see the most. So he had the biggest podium. So what he said changed policy.
Yeah. What else do you think about, again, broad swaths, but put on that doctor hat for a second. You work in an office, you have your own patients. What have you seen about COVID and how all this has impacted, the people in your life?
I think I've seen a lot of resilience. I've seen people who have, because of their nature, tried to take the best of a really bad situation, push through it, and live and be patient. I've also seen people who have lost their patience. I've seen people who, like you, I'm sure, have lost family members, have lost loved ones, have gotten COVID themselves, are scared and afraid. The whole gamut of emotions and responses. I mean, that is the privilege and burden of our profession. We see people, they are at their most vulnerable. And I think that's what has driven me to try to become more active and more vocal in terms of what I think we should get together and do as a society in terms of preparing for the next pandemic and making the changes in healthcare that we really need to protect ourselves and protect our families.
So that's kind of a great lead in. You are a practicing doctor. You see patients almost every day, right? When you're at work, you have a legal background and political knowledge. What did COVID show us? What did COVID show us about the healthcare system in the U.S. that's broken, and kind of where do we need to go from there?
Yeah, it's one of those things, like you said, where sometimes you don't realize something's not working optimally until you actually take it out for a spin. So I would say, when we took out our vaccine distribution for a spin, we realized that there's some glaring deficits and holes in it, especially trying to get a vaccine that needs to be stored at negative 70 degrees Celsius out to rural communities, or there's some glaring, I think, holes in some of our unemployment assistance programs where you had some people that were still considered essential workers and had to go out there all the time and continuously get exposed to COVID, or had less access to healthcare systems. There are some studies that would say, if you were a person that lived in, a crowded, lower income area and had less access to hospitals and continuing healthcare, then your risk of dying of COVID was significantly higher. Mm-hmm. And it also exposed the, I think, negative effect that people can get from any pandemic, from any illness, because of their comorbidities, because of uncontrolled diabetes, or unfortunately, the fact that 60 to 70% of the American population is either overweight or obese. I mean, these are things that, they're not cosmetic issues. They're issues. They're health issues. And, if your risk of dying of COVID is 2.5 times higher, because you're excessively overweight, the answer to that isn't to shame that person. The answer to that is to try to give that person the tools that they need and structure our healthcare system in a way in which we make it so that that person quickly gets back to health, and then that type of thing does not happen anymore.
There's a couple things that I wanted to throw in here with this, that I saw. One was, right now, for example, in Los Angeles, these hospitals are incredibly overwhelmed. I was at a hospital a couple weeks ago in LA that normally at max they have 100 patients. When I was there, they had increased that to 160. I mean, literally just at 5 tents outside, single occupancy room had been doubled. Now that's up to 220 because of this surge in COVID. And the thing that, and so it's like, okay, well, we don't have capacity to handle this surge. It's not like these hospitals had empty beds before COVID and were waiting for those. This was a system that in many places, maybe not Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, right? Maybe not the Kaisers, the Ritzius, whatever, but especially the county hospitals and the poorer places and rural, that were already bulging at the seams,
Right.
and then just dumping this COVID on top of it is so I would say that number one is like so much of the system every year would be overwhelmed, or we would in the ER, for example, during flu season would be full of patients that should be in the hospital, but they're waiting in the ER to get a bed all day long for days, makes that so much harder. So the system was like bulging from the seams at the beginning. So that's one thing that's like, wow, this thing was broken to begin with.
Yeah.
I don't know what the solution is. Let me say one other thing. I'll kick it back to you. And then juxtapose that, because that's still sick people medicine, acute,
Right.
the acute care medicine. When people get sick, that thing is kind of broken. But then on the other side of it is this whole concept of prevention. So it's like, well, this is bulging, and it's like, if we prevented it better, if we doubled down on whatever we know to prevent, whether it's heart attack, stroke, diabetes, whatever, or in this case, the virus, right? Masks and social distancing and so forth, and like good public health, which is known, by the way. It's not a mystery what that stuff is. And so you've got, at the same time, I don't know what the word is, contradiction, or it's almost a spiritual paradox. You got full hospitals, that's broken, and it's like, well, let's make more hospitals. But then on the other side, it's like, wait a minute, we could also be actually investing in prevention, in using known strategies that would solve both problems. I don't know. It just makes me crazy. We need somebody like you to fix this. How are we going to fix this?
The thing is, I think you hit the nail on the head when, if you think about a capacitor, or you think about any type of system that's designed to be flexible enough to take on extra energy or extra, whatever you want to fill into it. It doesn't just pop out in one particular direction, right? It doesn't just say, okay, well, we're going to, this is your capacitor. We're going to give a little bit more capacity over here, a little bit more capacity over here, and that's it. The entire system, like a balloon, increases to actually make room for these types of things. So in many instances, it boils down to this. It's a misnomer to say that we have a healthcare system. We have a bunch of individual siloed healthcare actors that kind of work together. But, I can ask your average medical school director, when was the last time we've had a new medical school or a new increase in 5% of the number of medical schools? What are we doing to increase the number of physicians and healthcare workers and other people out there? And we're not doing a lot, right? So there was a program at Hopkins, I think it's called maybe like Hopkins at Home or Care at Home or something similar to that, in which over the last 7 or 8 years, they've been using more wearables, things to check people's heart rates and make sure exactly.
I got mine on right now.
Yeah, and these types of tools, what they could do with that, in some instances, is see whether you're having an arrhythmia, see whether you are in heart failure, basically making it so that people could actually get care at home that they would otherwise be getting in the hospital. And what they found was, one, it dropped the costs in some instances up to 30%. So they found out they actually could treat people for heart failure at home. For two, it decreased the number of people that were elderly would get confused and have these high-risk injuries in the hospital because they're at their house, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many people raise their hand and say that they've heard of programs like that? Very few. Why? Because our system is not incentivized to make those types of programs happen. Telemedicine has been something.
Wait a minute. Why not?
It's not been proven. So there are a couple of reasons. One, it's not been proven to be where the money is, for one. If you get someone in a hospital, they're there for a week. The hospital can charge the insurance company $50,000. The hospital's like, okay, you could be treated at home, but we're kind of set up for you to be treated in the hospital, and we can get a high reimbursement that way. I'm not saying that's what happens.
So how do we incentivize prevention? That's the $1 million question, right?
It's $1 million question. Well, honestly, you need the ear of the people in power to actually do that. You either need to be one of the people in power yourselves, or you need the ear of the people in power to do it. And what happens in many instances, I hate to say it, is you get people that are elected to office. They surround themselves with people that they know and trust, but you can't be an expert in everything. So this person that may understand, let's say, health insurance policy, doesn't know anything about telemedicine. doesn't know. And then a big pandemic comes where everything needs to switch to telemedicine, and they're kind of scrambling around, pulling their hair out, trying to figure out what to do, right? So there's a disconnect between the people who know what to do and the people who are empowered to make the things happen.
But theoretically, we could invest more in prevention, right? There's nothing that's stopping us from doing that. Like, you could easily set up and create a system where you did more, you invested more in prevention, you even tracked the outcome, and then resulted in.
Well, Larry, let's go back to what you were saying on Instagram, which is humans respond to acute issues, right? So we had the CARES Act in March that put $2 trillion in the economy. We had the Fed put about another $2 trillion into the economy. And we just had this stimulus bill that put another $900 billion in the economy. I bet you, now granted, I haven't looked at what's probably about 15,000 pages of legislation yet. I've looked at some of it, but not all of it. I got to, get my coffee a few more times before I get through the whole thing.
And your Adderall and your stimulants to speed read.
Oh my God. Nightmare. Yeah, for like 3 weeks with no sleep. But I bet you the $1 million I don't have, that if you comb through that legislation, there's very little about, okay, this is how we have a quick reaction force to double the capacity of a hospital the next time this happens. Or this is how we figure out how to link wearables to telemedicine. It's great to get on a video and talk to someone about their health, but it'd be better if I could talk to you and say, hey, could you put the iPhone next to your ear so I can actually look in your ear canal and see what's in there? There's something. Or could you put the iPhone on your chest and I can see if you have an arrhythmia? That technology is out there. But the problem is we're not investing in it. And even our legislators and everyone that's making the rules aren't seeing the value of that right now.
Let me transition a little bit to a similar, it's not too far off of this, but you and I are talking about prevention. You take masks, for example.
Sure.
Such a kind of obvious thing at this point. We know it can prevent COVID, and it becomes politicized. And we're in this world. It seems to me that there is so much more just hate for the other side now than there was even 2 or 4 years ago or before. What do you think about that? Talk me through that, and how do we really come together as a nation, not just, oh, Trump wins and he's like, oh, now let's come together. Biden wins. Oh, now let's come together, and like the other side's like, I don't think so.
Right. I think the type of courage that we read about people having. So what kind of baffles me, to be honest with you, is people talk about the greatest generation. They talk about World War I. They talk about all these other types of truly world-changing events that were monumental and should be valued in terms of the people that sacrificed their lives for them. But what baffles me is the type of courage that I think we saw in a lot of, not just the people that went out there and sacrificed their lives, but in the politicians and people that led us was magnificent. It's what's to be expected, I think, in a democracy. I honestly say the challenge that we have now is we have a lack of political courage. And because of that, we allow people to just kind of settle into their camps and say, look, the real political courage comes in when you're willing to see what you have in common with the people that may on the surface may not look or sound exactly like you or come from the same cultures, as opposed to saying, okay, well, let's try to rev up my base, you rev up your base. We try to, discount the votes over in this direction. We get on the phone with a random Secretary of State and try to get an extra vote in this other direction. It takes real political courage, and that's what we're lacking. And until we get that back, until we as citizens demand that, it's not going to happen. Politicians, it's a one-way street. Well, it's 2 ways, but it's mostly one way in the sense of they respond to the cues that we give them. So we have to demand the political courage for them and say that we will only reward people who have it and punish the ones by voting them out of office that don't.
Political courage being to do the right thing, for example, in a way that may cost you some votes.
May cost you your votes, may cost you your job. I mean, the thing is, when you look back at kind of the way that political office was seen or even the model. People can say what they want about George Washington, but he did 2 terms in office, and he had an opportunity. People actually wanted him to sit for a 3rd term, and he said no. And a lot of other people that went into office at that time, whether they were members of the House or Senate, people had the jobs that they did before that. They went into office for a term of time to serve the public good, and then they went back out of office. They didn't become career politicians. It felt, this is what I'm going to do for 30 years. So, if the only thing they can see themselves doing is being a politician, then at the end of the day, sadly, they're going to do mostly whatever they can do to stay a politician, as opposed to go out and do something else.
Yeah. I think about, I feel like the landscape now is, if you want to win and appeal to either base, there's, kind of this seduction to the dark side. If you push these certain racial buttons, if you push, these certain whatevers, you're going to fire the base up a little more, you're going to get a little more votes. It's really hard to resist that kind of, how can you not, when you know that you can kind of get more votes there, and then it just kind of, we end up, it starts like this and it goes like
heroin,
like that.
Yeah.
Especially if not doing that is a form of political suicide. It's like, how do we get to, I can see how these guys get stuck in that. How do you get out of that?
Well, the same thing that we were taught in kindergarten, Larry. I mean, the means do not justify the end, right? I mean, you learn that when you were a little kid. Your parents and your teachers and everyone else taught that to you. But I think as people, grow up and they get older, and they want to have resources and they want to have a certain type of life, I think sometimes those basic life lessons get forgotten. But when they get forgotten, then as a society, we were worse off. And we end up in a situation where you have 400,000 people die of something they didn't have to die of, 20 million people infected, and then all the other downstream side effects of that.
I got a couple other topics here I want to get to. But
Yeah.
I'm gonna give you the choice, Dr. Lawyer. I was going to ask you, how are you doing in the office? Do you experience doctor burnout? I like that. And then talking about the system, how the system burns out docs, how we should be more politically active. You like to talk about teaching people how to fish.
Oh, yes.
And then also the rural-urban divide. Which of those sounds the most tasty to you?
Man, they all sound like they're already well seasoned, so it's kind of hard to figure out which one I'd tackle first. I honestly like teaching people how to fish the best, because I think if you do that, there's so many of these other things that will fall into place for someone. There really is there's no substitute for someone really being educated and understanding how to make the best choices for themselves and the ones they love.
Now, is that a typical Democrat idea on the left?
I don't know all the typical Democratic ideas on the left, but if it isn't, it should be. I'll tell you that much, because I think any system wants to, or should want to, make it so that you give people the framework for them to figure out what their best interests are, where they overlap with society, and then give them the tools to make those decisions. So it ends up being in someone's best interest to say, okay, I should try to get myself as educated as I can in the things that I really want to do. I should try to make sure that I save money for those things that I want for that rainy day. And then, let me look for the system and for the people that are going to help me achieve those things. And so when I look at what is the proper role of government in people's lives, it's not to, dictate every single thing to you or be, as been referred to as the nanny state. And it's also not to make it so that there's just anarchy and free reign. But you have to have that sweet spot where you give people the tools that they need in order to take care of themselves, be active members of society, and then also understand the importance of where their rights end and where someone else's begins.
Give me some examples of how the system might better teach people how to fish.
Yeah, I thought it was so. I was fortunate enough, I was pretty good at math and ended up doing calculus in high school, right? Your average person gets some type of algebra in 8th grade, for the most part, or at least in junior high. But what's interesting to me is it wasn't until I was 22 years old that I'd heard anything about a Roth IRA. I'd heard anything about investing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, say what you want about capitalism versus socialism or these other types of systems. No other system in society has raised more people out of poverty than some form of capitalism. I'm not talking about unrestrained capitalism. I'm just saying some form of it. And when we looked at systems that have been completely closed, whether it was India until the 70s, where they had economic issues and problems with their money system, or you look at China and the similar systems they had, these types of closed systems don't work as well. So why are we not, when we're trying to make sure that people make educated decisions about their retirement and educated decisions about their spending, why are we not teaching that to them when they're in 7th grade or 8th grade or in high school? We're teaching them all these other things, but we're not teaching them how to be self-reliant. And if we don't do that, then they'll never feel as if they have the stake in the game that they need to make the decisions that are best for them.
So like financial literacy taught in the schools, for example.
Financial literacy taught in schools would be big. Teaching someone how likely it is that you're going to end up overweight if you drink a Coke every single day from the time that you're 15 until you're 25. What happens to your metabolism at 20? Granted, you're not going to be able to get everything through to that 18-year-old because the frontal lobe isn't completely developed at that time. But I think if you give someone enough touches, eventually it's going to sink in. But I think in many instances, we've given up on people's ability to be critical thinkers. So we're not teaching them how to be critical thinkers.
God, it kind of gets exciting and overwhelming if you think about it. It's a similar mentality, education, investing earlier. This is like a form of prevention, not only in teaching health literacy or diet, nutrition and exercise, but then even finances and just life skills stuff too. I like that stuff.
I love it. I love that stuff.
Let's talk about burnout for a second. I know you need to go in 10 minutes or so.
I'd spend all day with
we could talk for a long time. I think a friend of mine a couple weeks ago is that I went to med school with. She's gonna leave medicine, and it's just really struck me. She's a great doctor and has such a good heart and is in it for all the right reasons, but has been so frustrated by the system. And I think a lot of doctors kind of feel the same way, just how the system is.
Sorry to interrupt, but I did want to ask you.
She does ER.
ER.
She does ER. And in the middle of the pandemic, she lost her benefits. So the hospital she worked for made cuts, and that was it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back for her, putting her own neck out there in the middle of that. And not to mention just the stress of each shift and the working and all that. And I feel like many of us are frustrated with a system that is often very bureaucratic, and decisions are made by CEOs,
right,
or even people who may have been doctors at one point who are no longer working and are just out of touch with what it's like to practice medicine. They've got all their metrics and all these system things, but it doesn't make the actual practicing of medicine any better, which in the end affects patient care. So I've gotten really interested in what can we do about that? Like, how can we support nurses and doctors and everybody that's actually working. And then what do we really want? Like, if we could dream up a better system, what could we do?
I think for me, when I think about burnout, I think about, why did I go into medicine in the first place? And I went into medicine because I valued the relationships I could have with people as I helped guide them through some of the most challenging times of their lives, or some of the most intimate fears that they have. I think as a system, we've walked really far away from that. Not on purpose, but it's happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a good example. So probably over the last 12 or 13 years, we've really pushed electronic health records, which has had many advantages, you can get access to records that someone had on the other side of the country and the other side of the world. They don't have to bring that paperwork into you. But there are tons of patients that say, doc, I hate the fact that I come in to see you, or I come in to see someone else, and you're looking at the computer 80% of the time.
They're like this.
The entire time, right? And they're
How
not.
How are you doing? How do you feel? How's your blood pressure? Great. See you next month.
Right. Yeah, that, or even I'm sure there's something similar in the ER where you're charting a bunch of stuff, you're hitting a bunch of the metrics that you have to, you're documenting all the stuff that you have to document, but you're not getting that time to spend with the patient that you need. I think if as a system we move back towards emphasizing that, I think it will move us pretty far down the road in terms of helping with respect to burnout. I mean, I've heard of some healthcare systems, they spent $500 million on an electronic health record system. Not that I'm pouring everything into this, but if you spend $500 million on an electronic health record system, how much money are you going to have left to actually spend on staff, right? Yeah. So your decision making at that point is, hey, I just put $500 million into this system that's going to get me the metrics and get me the reimbursement I need. So, okay, I have 8 nurses and I could really use 12. I'll get one extra who's kind of a floater, and she won't have benefits, he or she or whatever, right? So I think the problem is so many decisions have been made so far away from, as your friend was saying, the people on the front lines. That's not only the way that we lost Vietnam, if you look at some of the books about it, that's also, I think, the way that we're losing the fight in healthcare in terms of burnout for our doctors, in terms of patient care, in terms of patient satisfaction, and in terms of what patients really want at the end of the day in terms of their interaction with their healthcare provider.
I'll give you one example. In one ER that I work in has this medical record that's it's just difficult. It's one of the worst ones that I've ever used. And for a period of time, that those computers were down. This was a period of weeks. And so we went back to paper. And initially, and I had worked at this hospital back when it was paper a decade ago. And so initially, there was a little transition. It was annoying. But the paper was faster.
Oh yeah.
And from my experience, and this surprised me, it was better. It just circled the orders, filled out certain things, and then I did my documentation on the computer, printed it out, signed it. That became part of the paper chart that we used to do in the old days. And I realized, I was like, now there's some medical records that make things faster, but many of them don't. They're very clunky, awful computer programs to use. And again, you take a step back, and really, what was it about? It was for billing, medical, legal. It wasn't even as much about communicating doctor to doctor or making a record. And it was absolutely nothing about the patient and physician experience, which is the thing that's at the core of medicine. Like, that's the healing relationship. They're not going to take the pills if you don't have that trust and everything. And we just dropped this big piece of shit computer,
literally between you and the patient.
In between you and the patient, and nobody cared to figure that out.
Nope. Well, not just
I don't know what
I was going to say that no one cares. It's like one of my favorite analogies, which is everyone is treated. The personalized touch in medicine is like, it's going the way of the dinosaurs, man. I mean, you go into a situation with a patient, and one of my favorite analogies is, okay, if you have a room of 12 people that are between 5 foot and 5'12", basically 6 feet, you don't treat everyone in the room as if they're 5'6", right? The fact of the matter is, in medicine, we've gone so far to the left in terms of saying, this is what you need, this is what you have to take, I don't care what you think, this is what the computer tells me, and this is how I'm going to get reimbursed, that we've lost the trust and we've lost the interaction with patients that they crave. Some of my patients don't want to go on a statin. Guess what? That's okay. It really is. I can tell them what the risk is if they're not going on it. I could tell them it'd be better if they were vegan. But at the end of the day, you have to respect people's decision making, and you have to respect what they feel is the best thing for them and not intercede that.
I'm surprised that one got me as worked up as I was, but let's just listening to you even give those examples too. I think so many of us just feel like at a deep part at our core, we're going in a wrong direction. Sure. It's a necessary one. Yeah, you got to pay the bills and the system has to go on, but it's so disconnected from what I think doctors, nurses, and patients really value the most. It's truly been lost. It's truly been lost.
Dude, it's been a fun hour, man. I can't say, like I said, I could do this all day. Except
we should do it again. Thank you again for doing this. Tell me once again where people can find you. Kermit Jones, MDJD.com.
MDJD.com, Kermit.Jones for Instagram, and then Kermit Jones MDJD Twitter. Those are all the social handles that they can find me on. And then, yeah, if they ever want to, they can come hang out in Northern California with me. We'll go hiking, snowboarding. We'll have a good time. Horseback riding. We'll have all types of fun out here.
Feel free to reach out to Dr. Jones on social. You could reach out to me with questions. I have a feeling we'll have him back. Thank you very much for your time, doctor. Stay safe and practice. Keep doing what you do. And I will hope that you can make some of these ambitious changes at one point using that MDJD. The healthcare system in the world needs it. God knows.
I hope so, man. And stay safe. All the best to your family. And next time we can see each other in person, we got to go out and grab a drink or something sometime.
That sounds good.
Take care, brother.
All right. Stop.